folks, I'm Allison. Welcome to my booktube channel. Today I'm reviewing the books that I read this autumn. There aren't that many of them because I was reading a lot of sci-fi and fantasy, and so they are like chunky books. But I had a really good couple of reading months. I just was absolutely tearing through these books because basically they were all really good and really fun to read. The first book that I read was Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil by V.E. Schwab. This is a book about 3 different women in 3 different times throughout history and their transitions into life as vampires. This book I was really excited to read because in sort of late summer, I read a book called Bloom by Delilah S. Dawson that I thought was going to be a sapphic vampires book, and it wasn't. It turned out to be really horror. And so then I had just been wanting to read a sapphic vampires book, and this one, you know, came onto the scene at exactly the right time in my reading life. I will say this wasn't the strongest of V.E. Schwab's works. I absolutely love the Darker Shade of Magic series, and I enjoyed Addie LaRue, although I didn't think that the ending was that exciting. This book, I think it is difficult to have storylines that follow a bunch of different characters, and you know, even in a pretty thick book, this book is almost 550 pages, but even so, you don't end up with that much time to spend per story arc, right? If you have 3 quite unconnected story arcs in 500 and so pages, you're only getting 150 pages per story arc. That said, I really enjoyed the first character arc. The first character that you're introduced to is Maria, who is born in 1532, and she sort of kicks off the lineage of these vampires. And her story arc was really fun because she starts out as this incredibly sympathetic character. She is a young woman who is fiercely independent and living in a time when society expects her to get married and settle down and basically just be an ornament to her husband. And she really rebels against that life. And then she, over the course of the novel, kind of becomes a villain. You know, she really gets into the vampire life, let's say, and some of the characteristics that she had when she was a human, her independence and her recklessness, are really amplified as a vampire. And so she becomes a very fascinating character to follow because my feelings for her, at least over the course of the book, really changed in terms of my sort of where my sympathies lied. The second character arc, I'm not sure I even really remember that much of what happened to her. She's more of a connective tissue kind of character than she really feels like a live character in the story. And then the third character is the one who you are sort of following at the very beginning, and you sort of close the book following. And her name is Alice, and she's in modern times. And she is sort of inheriting the legacy of, you know, these other women's stories and experiences. And Alice is very likable. She's a little bit of a bland kind of character. You know, she's sort of, in some ways, I think there are some stereotypes and tropes kind of animating her character that I wish maybe there had been some more, I don't know, a little more nuance to. But one thing I really liked is that she is presented sort of in contrast to her older sister, who really serves as sort of a foil for her. And you, throughout the course of the book, see all these flashbacks of her relationship to her older sister that, you know, that really help you come to see how Alice came to be the person that she is. And that relationship is also really interesting. The older sister, it's sort of sad you don't actually ever really get to meet the older sister. You only, see her through Alice's memories thinking about her. But, because Alice is Scottish, and she's going to school in an American university. And so her family, you don't see any of her family because they're abroad. But I thought she was a fun character to follow. I definitely was the most excited for her chapters because she feels like the character we're really following. I think when you have multiple timelines and one of them is the present day, that often feels like the most compelling timeline, and certainly in this case it did. Overall, there was a lot I liked about this book. The setup was fun. Vampires is just a fun premise to be playing with, and this sort of line of women vampires is just a fun concept. And definitely the aesthetic of the book, the way that the characters are described and the settings are described, is very spooky, vibey, gothic vampire. And I really liked all of that. But the book also felt a little bit bleak and angry in a way that I found sort of unsatisfying. And in some ways that makes sense. Life as a vampire, I imagine, is quite bleak. It's often presented as this sort of romantic, exciting thing, but fundamentally you're not human anymore and you're killing people to survive, and that's pretty bleak. And you aren't gonna age, and time has no meaning because it's not fleeting, and so everything is just one experience in a series of endless experiences. And so for lots of reasons, I understand why a book about vampires can end up feeling quite bleak. But I think this book is missing some of the philosophy, I suppose. There's some vampire books that are fluffy and vibey and sexy and fun. And then there are other vampire books that are moody and melancholic and really philosophical. And I think this book didn't quite hit the balance either way. I didn't really feel like it quite had enough of a unique perspective and had enough of a thought-provoking message, let's say, to be as sort of bleak and angry as it was. It just wasn't that fun to read, and I didn't come away from it really feeling like, oh, that got me in the gut, like it's gonna stick with me kind of thing. So overall, I might give this a 6.5 out of 10. It wasn't bad. I read it pretty quickly, but I think not V.E. Schwab's strongest work. The next book that I read was Blood Over Brighthaven by M.L. Wang. This book is really interesting in that it starts out feeling like it's going to be an incredibly down-the-line sci-fi novel. The protagonist is the first woman magician who is going to be admitted to this prestigious magic college in this very patriarchal society, and everyone around her is trying to undermine her. She is, instead of being assigned a proper magician assistant, is assigned essentially a janitor to be her lab assistant because the other magicians are trying to be mean to her. And then he turns out to be unexpectedly really smart, and there's a flirtation there, and it really has the feel of classic down the line fantasy kind of plot. What makes this book quite interesting is that it has a colonialism overlay, let's say, where a lot of what is happening in the book, the magic system and the society and the way that the characters, the sort of hierarchy among different races of characters in the book, are an analogy to colonialism and the exploitation of the global South. And it's presented very well. The magic system is presented in a way where the exploitation is very explicit, and once you sort of figure it all out, part of the book is kind of figuring out the secret of what's really going on in this society and what are the skeletons in the closet. But once you figure it out, the way that the sort of metaphor for this exploitation is presented is very visceral in a way that I found quite affecting. And the main character is quite interesting because she comes from the culture of people that are the oppressors, and has a lot of biases and stereotypes, and has, through her position of privilege, quite unknowingly committed a lot of horrific acts of oppression. And so you have to watch her really come to grips with the society that she lives in, and the way that she is, complicit in the society, and the seeming impossibility of breaking out of these, of these sort of social roles. And all of that is intense and quite shocking and very well done. My one criticism of this book, and having read this book actually makes me think that I was a little bit too harsh on Babel by R.F. Kuang. The book fundamentally has a sort of fantasy plot arc, insofar as the resolution is a fantasy resolution where you have like a sort of final boss battle kind of thing, right? So many fantasy books are like that, where the character is learning and growing and building their skills and, figuring out who they are, but it's sort of leading up to a final kind of magical confrontation, right? Like a sort of physical confrontation of who's powerful and who can be, who's the cleverest and the most powerful, and that kind of thing. And the problem with that is that it really breaks down as a resolution for this colonialism metaphor, because that is just not really how social phenomena resolve. These social movements where people are able to, abolish slavery in the American South, or get the right to vote for women, or, end apartheid in South Africa, all of these kinds of movements are movements, right? There are lots of people doing little things over a long time to change hearts and minds and change the law and move sort of society, to some degree together, maybe sort of dragging some people along, but at least to get a large enough group of people moving in the same direction to be able to make these changes. And I think that always, for me, makes these kinds of fantasy endings where there's like one big magical confrontation and things sort of fall apart feel kind of hollow. I mean, that was really how I felt about Babel too, is I loved the setup. And then the resolution was a sort of boss battle, and that just didn't feel authentic to me. And I think that is like a real problem or not problem, but a real challenge, let's say, for writers trying to use sci-fi and fantasy as a way to speak to these social issues, because these traditional kind of sci-fi fantasy plots don't really map onto the way that social change happens. I mean, when I think about this being done well, for instance, right, I think about maybe the first Dune book, where you have this sort of slow building of this character, and everything is sort of starts spiraling out of control. And, what you think is going to be this hero's journey turns out to be a story about how, power corrupts, and the person who is amassing power may think that they have sort of ultimate control, but actually that's not how violence works. Violence begets violence, and even if you think you're doing it for a good cause, it almost never works out that way, right? And that, I think, that ending where Paul unleashes essentially this like horrific violent movement across the universe feels very authentic as the way that this kind of, deification of a figure can play out. And I think, this is something that I don't have an answer to. I don't know how I think a book like Babel or a book like this should end to feel satisfying as, as sort of the resolution for its metaphor. But yeah, but I am very excited to keep reading books like this, and to see, see what other people's solutions are. I would probably give this a 7.5 out of 10. Okay, the next book that I read, I don't have a physical copy of because I lent it to a friend, but it was The Devils by Joe Abercrombie. I have not read any of Joe Abercrombie's other works. This was my introduction to his bibliography. And I thought it was a really fun book. I've seen comments from people who love him and are really deep into his work that they thought this book felt a little shallow, a little too jokey, but I thought it was awesome. I thought it was so funny and so fun. And I've seen it described a lot as feeling like sort of a D&D campaign, and that felt exactly right to me. So basically, The Devils is a book about a sort of ragtag group who have to safely transport this woman named Alex, who grew up believing that she was just like an orphan thief, sort of street rat kid in this like magical urban underworld. And then it turns out that she's the long lost princess or long lost heir to this empire. And so they have to transport her safely to the seat of the empire where she can try to like amass support and take power before the usurpers can find her and kill her and take her throne. And the group of people are made up of two sort of, I don't know if they're volunteers or employees exactly or what. One is this like grizzled old soldier who has worked for the empire for a long time, or, been in the service of the empire for a long time. And the other is kind of just like his friend who seems like kind of a mercenary and is maybe just there for the paycheck, but is a lot of fun. And then the other people in the group are all prisoners. And they're, at the very beginning of the book, the head of the religious order in this area, who is this very magical child, does a binding spell on them to basically make them have to stay with the group and try to safely transport the princess. And they are an elf who is so cute and such a sweet little character, and a werewolf who is insane and hilarious, and a vampire who is a really fun vampire character because he starts out this like really withered old almost corpse because he isn't allowed to drink. They don't like give him fresh blood when he's in prison, but when they let him out to go on this quest, he starts like drinking little bits of people's blood here and there, and by the end he's like really hot, which I thought was really funny. He sort of slowly ages in reverse over the course of the book. And then this like sort of evil wizard guy who is like a little bit insecure, but like puts on this big bravado to cover it up. He's like a little bit like Wizard of Oz style, like, crash boom, like the great sorcerer of whatever, but then actually he's just like kind of this awkward dude. And I forgot, there's one other sort of volunteer who's like a priest, and he starts out being this very sort of strict by the book kind of guy, and it's very fun over the course of the book to watch him, sort of loosen up and like shed some of his prejudices. And really that's the book. The book is just about this group of people dealing with each other and getting on each other's nerves, but also sharing moments of intimacy. And, they go through various challenges. They have to, get on a boat and go to this place, and then they have to, walk to this place, and there's a war, and they have to figure out what to do about like a little land squabble border war, and they have to figure out what to do. And then they, somebody's chasing them, and then it's, like all sorts of just like little things that come up that they have to deal with. But the real beauty of the book is just how fun it is to get to spend time with these characters. And I really, really liked the ending of the book too. I'm not going to spoil it, but I'll just say I thought the book was going to end in a way that was very sort of pat and neat, And that was, you know, maybe just because I haven't read any Abercrombie, so I didn't know what to expect, but that's not true. It ended in a way that felt extremely true to life. And yeah, and that sort of stuck with me a little bit afterwards, in, you know, in how sort of difficult life can be sometimes. So yeah, so I really loved The Devils. I would probably give it an 8.5, even a 9, maybe out of 10. It was just a really fun fantasy romp, and I didn't really have any complaints about it. And then the last book that I read was The Will of the Many by James Islington. I didn't actually realize that the second book is just come out, and I think I'm gonna wait until it comes out in paperback because I don't really want to pay for the hardback version. But I quite liked this. This is another book that is sci-fi fantasy, but is very much a metaphor for exploitation. You know, this is a book that is less about exploitation in a sort of like colonialism sense and more about exploitation in a class warfare kind of sense. So it's about a society in which people are grouped into different levels, and the people at each level have to essentially give over to the people at the level above them a portion of their will. And it's not exactly clear what will is, but it's something like your sort of spirit to live and your energy and your life force and your power. And so the people at the very bottom who, you know, have to give will to the next level of people and don't have anybody like giving will to them, and that's, you know, that's like the vast majority of people, are just constantly exhausted, right? Because they just, you know, they're trying to like live their life. Usually they're doing sort of, you know, minimum wage kind of labor, physical labor jobs, and they're doing it with 80% of their will. And that's just their day-to-day life, right? It's just like, that's just how things are. Like you're just tired and sort of, you know, you just feel like you're having a little bit of your life force sucked away every day, and that's just life. And then for each level above them, people, you know, they have to, it's like 7 of them have to cede will to one person at the level above them, which is like a sort of, you know, lower mid-management kind of level. And those people are, you know, stronger than the average person. They, you know, they like hit harder than the average person, and they can like take a punch because they have all of this extra will being ceded to them. And then above them, there are like several levels moving up through society. And each level, the people get stronger and more powerful. And obviously, even though the society is supposed to be based on merit, you know, rich people and their kids basically always end up at the high levels and have all the opportunities, and, you know, poor people are basically born at the bottom of the hierarchy, and they live their life at the bottom of the hierarchy, and their kids, you know, live their lives at the bottom of the hierarchy, because you can start ceding will as a pretty young kid. And so you can imagine, you know, if you're 8 and your parents start, you know, sucking little bits of your will away or selling it off to people to be able to feed you, you're not going to be able to do as well in school. You know, you're not going to be able to achieve your goals and excel and impress people and move your way up the hierarchy because you're already starting out sort of tired and depleted. Anyways, so that's the sort of basic premise of the book. And the empire is basically going around in sort of Roman Empire style, like taking over all of the little societies around and, you know, colonizing them and like bringing them in to the empire. And the main character was a prince in one of these societies that got taken over, and he has to escape into exile and is pretending to be an orphan. And basically because he was raised as a prince, he has a lot of sort of knowledge and abilities. Like he was like trained in sword fighting, and he was taught all these languages. And so he is able to perform much better than, you know, he seems essentially like a prodigy, right? Like he has all these abilities that if he were really self-taught would be insane to have acquired. And so he gets sort of plucked out of obscurity and sent to this fancy academy. It's like college, essentially, high school college, where the kids from the realm are trained up to be, you know, to follow in their parents' footsteps as, you know, generals and senators and what have you. And so it's sort of about his experiences there, and the people who send him there, the family that adopts him, has sort of an ulterior motive. They have some things about the, you know, about the academy that they want him to investigate, and also there's a sort of brewing revolution among the, you know, the people that have been invaded. And so that, you know, there are also people who want to use him to try to, you know, further this revolution. So he's basically just getting sort of pulled in a lot of different directions, and is just basically trying to survive. Like most of this book, I imagine the second book and the third book, he'll, you know, really get a fire under his butt to like lead the revolution or whatever. But in this book, he's really just trying to like not get killed by all the various people who keep threatening to kill him if he doesn't help them carry out their plans. So yeah, so it was a fun first book. I mean, it's pretty long. It's almost 700 pages, and I read it in maybe 2 or 3 days. Like, it really moves. Yeah, and I think it's hard to judge the first book in a series because it's just doing so much setup, and so you don't really know where it's going to go and how well the plot arc is going to feel. You know, it's hard to compare, you know, a book like this that is doing sort of social justice commentary to a book like this where I know how this ends, and so I can say I didn't find it that satisfying. Whereas this book, you know, I don't know how it's all going to resolve. So a little TBD. But I really enjoyed it, and I would say maybe 8 out of 10. So there you have it. There are, well, the 3 books that I read plus The Devils in September and October. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to hear more from me, please consider subscribing. And thank you so much for spending some of your one wild and precious life with me watching this video.